better? Do you like this side of me better? Which side is best?
Well, I don't really think you have a bad side, Bryan. So either way, it's perfectly fine. As it has been remarked, we are strategically sitting as far away from one another as we possibly can.
Somebody told me, a preaching friend of mine said, I watched that Bible study that you do, and it was really good, but it looks like that person is trying actively to sit as far away from you as possible. And
which is true. I am actively...
It's social distancing and Bryan's regular life, because that's just what I experience, people actively trying to move away, which is normal. It's just how
So
I
I just want everyone
life.
to know that we are actively practicing social distancing here, that this setup is not on accident.
And we literally take our masks off and do this. So
that's right. And then when we get ready to leave, we sanitize our hands and put our masks back on.
And there was one time when Justin was feeling like he had a little bit of a cold, stayed away. So we are being as safe and as careful as possible. But we hope you enjoy our new set. I've got my little plants right here that hopefully I can tend to. Of course, they're not real, but thank you to the Pasantians for setting up our new set. It looks amazing. So we are continuing our study in the Gospel of Mark, and we are going to conclude with a story at the end of Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 45, and then get into Mark chapter 7 tonight. So go ahead, please open up your Bible, either on your phone or if you have a Bible at home, please follow along. And if you have any questions or you need anything and you just want to know more about Jesus or more about our church, you can email me at bryan@glendale.church. Love to hear from you and have your feedback and your thoughts. We are a Glendale church located just outside of Los Angeles. We consider ourselves to be a home in LA, but especially right now, we are a home for everyone in every part of the world. And that's a great blessing of technology that we get a chance to connect with people from all over the place. And so if you find this at some later date or tonight and you have some questions for me, please reach out and let me know. So we're starting in Mark chapter 6, verse 45, with Jesus walking on the water. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up on the hills by himself to pray. Late that night, the disciples were in the boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus said to them at once, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here." Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. After they'd crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret. They brought the boat to shore and climbed out. The people recognized Jesus at once, and they ran throughout the whole area, carrying sick people on mats to wherever he was. Wherever he went, in villages, cities, or the countryside, they brought the sick out to the marketplaces. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. So an interesting story, Jesus walking on the water.
Yeah.
I would argue that perhaps this one is the most referenced by any just casual person. If anybody knows anything about the miracle of Jesus, mention walking on water. If you're on a lake, someone might challenge you to do it, and you won't succeed, but you might get challenged. Yeah. And this is one of the many times when Jesus is out on the water with the disciples, and we had one earlier in the Mark. This is different because he's doing some teaching. He says, all right, let me hang back here and dismiss everybody. And the disciples just start cruising. And after spending some time in prayer, the literal text says in the third watch of the night, which can be anywhere from 3 o'clock to 6 in the morning, he's just out there doing some water skiing. And it's very odd. The passage tells us that he intended to go by them, which is confusing at best, if not very perplexing. What exactly was he trying to get to the other side before they did and say, hey guys, I'm over here? Yeah. But they see Jesus and think that he's a ghost, and they cry out, and they have this exchange.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's some interesting things probably happening here given the context. So we have just had this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. It appears that this narrative is taking place pretty much right after that has happened. Jesus is dismissing that crowd of 5,000 after they've eaten. He instructs the disciples to get into a boat and to leave. You know, it probably is moving in the direction of being relatively late in the evening. And interestingly enough, I think something that we sometimes miss in this narrative is in verse 46, Jesus himself leaves to go pray. So even suggesting something about his prayer life, something about the way that maybe he finds his refreshment or his reconnection with the Father. Oftentimes we assume that Jesus' relationship with God is particularly close because of Jesus' divinity. And what we miss is that Jesus' relationship to the Father is close because of his practices as well. You know, his practice of prayer, his practice of meditation, his practice of actively engaging with God the Father. And so we see that. And yeah, and then we have this sort of interesting moment where
just a quick side note
Yeah.
on that. So we started a series on the Lord's Prayer on Sunday, and love to have you join in and watch that, the next installment on Sunday at 10:30. But I talked about how the only question the disciples ask about spiritual disciplines in any of the four Gospels is,
Right.
teach us to pray.
Teach us to pray.
And I think it's because they see him doing this all the time.
Right. Yeah.
And they recognize, like, oh, there must be something that
Right.
comes from this, and teach us how to do it. I think that is definitely significant, that it is the divinity that he has, but it's also because of these practices. And this is what
Right.
he's constantly doing. He's constantly going away and moving away from the crowds and spending that time alone
Yeah, I
with
mean,
God.
there's a deep intentionality in Jesus' ministry. There's a deep intentionality in the time that he spends with God the Father. And I think what he does then is he models for us what that intentionality looks like too. So I think, you know, sometimes we don't do enough in really sort of embracing what we see Jesus acting out, living out in his ministry as models for us.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so we then move into this sort of odd, I mean, let's be honest, sort of odd moment between Jesus and the disciples. I mean, I think the thing that really kind of brings this to the forefront is when it says in verse 48 that he intended to pass them by. I'm not sure what that means, and I'm not sure
Yeah.
why he would do that.
And no one knows what it means, actually. There's about 7 different explanations on theories on exactly
Yeah.
what it means. Personally, my interpretation is that it is a connection. In the Old Testament, there's an understanding of God like passing by.
Sure.
It's showing glory.
Sure.
So that would be what I would
Yeah.
take it to be. Do you have a take on that? Do you think?
Well, I mean, it's certainly maybe evokes in some way that experience that you're talking about with Moses. Moses on the mountain with God, asked to see God. God says, "You can't see me, but God can pass by, and you can kind of see my back." So maybe it's drawing that in, but then also, you know, this moment comes after this series of moments where Jesus has demonstrated an immense amount of power. Whether we're talking about the healing of the paralytic earlier on in Mark, we're talking about the healing or the raising of Jairus' daughter, the healing of the woman with the bleeding problem, the various, the casting out of the Gerasene demoniac's demons, the various healings that Jesus has been engaged in, and then the healings that these disciples have already been engaged in. And then this comes just on the back of the feeding of the 5,000. So maybe Jesus' thought here is if they can just see me, if I can just pass by, then they'll recognize that I'm here. They'll recognize the presence of God is here, and they'll be safe. They'll feel safe. Their faith will kick in. The problem is their faith doesn't kick in. It goes in another direction. Instead of seeing him and being emboldened, they see him and are even more terrified because they think he's a ghost. And that, I think, sort of reorients Jesus in the moment to doing something different than maybe what he was planning on.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that way of putting it, but yeah, I think that probably is what's happening here. He gets the opportunity to show, yeah, this is who I am, and instead of them saying, "Oh, cool, great,"
Right.
it's no, you guys still don't get it. You don't understand,
Right.
And they're afraid, and this is, I think, one of the stories that definitely is us in various moments. Again, in this season, as we're going through hard times where we find ourselves in what some people call like the messy middle. We're in the middle of trying to figure this out. We don't know what life is going to look like on the other side, how long that's going to take.
Yeah.
And it's in these moments that we definitely cry out to God. And I think ultimately he has compassion, but it's this voice saying, don't be afraid, take courage. And then he says, I am, which is obviously significant Old Testament language as he's connecting himself to God and God's presence. And that would have evoked an image certainly in the mind of a Jew who would have heard it and understood, okay, this is what he's claiming.
Yeah.
And that I think is something that we all could hear and take some comfort from, that Jesus says that to us. Like, don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Take courage. I'm here. I'm with you. And you might not see how this is going to end or how this is going to turn out, but take courage. I'm here.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, we sort of are confronted in a way maybe with Jesus' frustration with the disciples. And that frustration isn't really voiced here in a straightforward way, but this line, their hearts were hardened, I think really points in the direction again of them not really being able to piece together all that they've seen and experienced at this point. And it's interesting that this idea of a hardened heart comes in the middle of a narrative that also seems to be pulling together so much of these sort of bits and pieces of the elements of Israel's story at the same time. Like you've already pointed out, sort of maybe this vague referencing to Moses' experience with the presence of God on the mountain and him passing by as Jesus passes by. We have the wind and the waves, this sort of ocean experience, which maybe in some ways recalls the parting of the Red Sea and sort of that experience. Then we also have the way that God demonstrates his power over and over and over again in the life and the experience of Moses, and Pharaoh's heart remains hardened, like even in the midst of seeing God's miraculous power and all of the things that happened, it takes death, right? And catastrophic death for Pharaoh to finally sort of be reoriented. And here, in the midst of all of these things, the disciples are still not quite there yet. They're just still not quite piecing together all of these things that they've experienced. And so I think it's sort of fitting there at the end that we have this line about hardened hearts as a way of kind of drawing together, in the midst of all of this miraculous stuff, you still don't get it. Your fear overpowers your faith. And I think it forms like a really important learning moment for us too.
Yeah, I think of the parallels of Peter walking on the water, and how as he is starting that journey, he takes some steps and he's doing it, but then it says when he looks to everything else, that's when he starts to sink.
Right.
And I think that's a word for us right now as we think about where is it that we're looking right now? What is it that we're focused on? There's stuff right now that if you go down the rabbit holes could make you very anxious about this time, and rightfully so. It's sometimes troubling, but how do you find the presence of God during this and understand that God has been with people through storms before?
Yeah.
And that as we sit in a 3 a.m. moment in the darkness, that God is with us, God's presence is there, and how do you find ways to console yourself in that? And I think for most of us, we would say, yeah, God has been faithful before. There's things that I've experienced before that have happened, and similar to the disciples who've had these experiences just fresh, they probably still have some bread left over that they're eating on the boat. So like they should have a little bit of a snack probably from what has just happened. But right when they see something again that causes them a little bit of fear, it's just like going right back into that. And I think that's a real testimony to our humanity, that it's just, that is how we are. We once again see that thing, and it's easy to forget how God has been faithful in the past. It's easy to forget the things that God has done even in your life and in your recent time. And Jesus says, don't be afraid, with the intention to pass by, perhaps connecting to God's glory. And then I'm with you.
Right.
I'm a representative of God. And so you don't need to be afraid of every ghost that you see, because God is with you and God has not abandoned you.
Yeah.
I also find it interesting, then there's so many almost throwaway lines in the Gospel of Mark that talk about just throngs of people coming to see Jesus, and just the masses coming and people getting healed and experiencing this unbelievable power. And I just find it really interesting, that versus him then getting away to pray. And that's like what he always seems to be wrestling with. And I know for many of us coming into this season, we would have said the reason perhaps that we don't pray more often is because we're too busy. There's just a lot going on.
Sure.
Life has a lot. And now for a lot of us, life has slowed down a little bit, and we still probably aren't doing that. And honestly, as we see what's happening to Jesus here, if you're busier than Jesus, you probably have problems, because he has tons of people around, and it's like critical level stuff. The stuff that we often are doing doesn't really rise to that critical level.
Right.
It's healing people who are sick and doing some really important work, but he still finds that time.
Yeah.
And I think that's this really interesting tension that we need to recognize as, how do we connect ourselves to a deeper source, as things, yes, they are busy, and there's going to be stuff that is constantly coming at you every single day. But Jesus himself, while he had really important, really valuable stuff to do, also sought that connection to God.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like one of the issues too in Mark's gospel is access. Jesus dealing with access, and even as we looked early on, his family being concerned about how much access people have to him. The story of the woman with the bleeding problem in Jairus' daughter. Who touched me? And the disciples are like, "Are you kidding me? Everybody's touching you." And then you have sort of the follow-up to this narrative with Jesus continuing to heal the sick in Gennesaret, and people just even wanting to touch the fringe of his clothing. And at some point, Jesus, at various points really in Mark's gospel, just has to say, I need some time away. And I think not only to sort of reconnect with God, but to recharge, I think, himself, that you can give of yourself until you're empty, but you need to get refilled at some point too. And I think Jesus models that he is not just sort of limitless in this way, that if he is truly human, humans get tired, we get worn out, we get depleted, and we've got to find ways to be engaged in sort of healthy practices that enable us to be engaged in these things for the long haul. Not for a short period of time, but ongoing. So
and I think that this is actually a great setup for then Mark chapter 7, because if you think about it, this story, okay, Jesus says, all right, I've fed all these people. Let's finish this thing up. Let me spend some time in prayer. He has this intention of what he's trying to do, and I think it's just a great line. He's trying to pass them by. We don't know exactly what was going on.
Right.
Just, who knows? Maybe there's some great fish on the other side or something. He was going to go fishing or something. But he has this intention, and it's almost like the disciples distract him from that for whatever. It's like, hey, get over here. We need you. Right. And he's not angry, but a little bit resigned. Just don't be afraid. It's I. Don't worry about it. I've got you. So he's dragged away from his intention. Then they show up, and it's actually not the place that they intended to go. Actually, they land somewhere else, and they show up on that shore, and everybody's coming, and everybody's doing this stuff. And then there's this story that I think is really important, especially if you consider yourself to be a religious person at all. Right. But it's good for anybody at any moment. But that I think is just an interesting backdrop with Jesus, like trying to do something, and it's just like constantly just getting off track and having things that he has to take care of. And then we turn to Mark chapter 7. So Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 1. It's kind of a long section. I'll read through verse 23. One day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they've poured water over their cupped hands, as required by their ancient traditions. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market unless they immerse their hands in water. This is but one of the many traditions they've clung to, such as the ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the religious law asked him, "Why don't your disciples follow our age-old tradition? They eat without first performing the hand-washing ceremony." Jesus replied, "You hypocrites," which is always a tough start. "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God, for you ignore God's law and substitute your own tradition.' Then he said, 'You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God: honor your father and mother, and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of father or mother must be put to death. But you say it's all right for people to say to their parents, "Sorry, I can't help you, for I vowed to give to God what I would have given to you." In this way, you let them disregard their needy parents. And so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition. And this is only one example among many others." Then Jesus called the crowd to come to him and hear. "All of you listen," he said, "and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you. You're defiled by what comes from your heart." Then Jesus went into a house to get away from the crowd, and his disciples asked him what he meant by this parable. "Don't you understand either?" he asked. "Can't you see that the food you put into your body cannot defile you? Food does not go into your heart, but only passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer." By saying this, he declared that every kind of food is acceptable in God's eyes. And then he added, "It is what comes from within that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you."
Yeah, I mean, it's this interesting moment where I think, Jesus is being challenged by the Pharisees and by being questioned about his relationship to well-established and long-held traditions. And Jesus' pushback, I think, is ultimately, these traditions and these commandments, I think, were actually put in place to draw the community together, to unite the community with a common identity, to unite the community with common practices, to unite the community in a way that drew out their distinctiveness, right? Like, this is who we are. And I think his point ultimately is that instead of these commandments and practices being something that draws us together, it's now being something used to be divisive, something that is used to establish a particular level of righteousness or justice. But the problem is, in the midst of all of this sort of wrangling and legal wrangling, we're leaving out the really important parts. Honor your father and mother. What do our interpersonal relationships look like? Yeah, we have clean pots and pans, and we have clean hands, and we've held to ritual purity, but we're doing injustice with one another. We're doing injustice in our own homes. So whatever we think these traditions were for, and whatever we think these practices were for, we're missing the point now. We've turned it into something else. And so I think it's this really powerful and interesting moment then when Jesus is pushing back against this and saying, yeah, we can keep all of these things, but why are we doing them? What are they for? And what are they designed to do?
Yeah, and I think it's something, the ceremonial cleaning and some of that stuff was adopted from some of the Old Testament and the laws that they then expanded on. And in the Jewish mindset, religion was like making hedges around the law. That was the goal, to make it so you didn't actually mess with the heart of it. And so you would create all these things to make sure and get around it. This one, I think, actually had some some good reasons behind it, because the temple is destroyed, and so the thought is that the home is now the temple, and so you want to honor God in everything that you do. So you wash your hands. This is a good practice for coronavirus season. You'll wash your hands, get yourself clean, because the thought is that God's presence is with you at every moment. It's holiness. It's setting you up for right relationships and then getting you into the presence of God.
Yeah.
And I think Jesus is not saying that's a bad idea. In fact, I think he would say that's a good idea, to try and connect yourself to God's holiness. But for the people here, I think they have made it into something that is not truly what is most important. I've told a story before at church about my love for Nutella, and I just love it a lot. If I have Nutella at the house, it's not a good idea. Manny would say, you eat this too fast when you have it, so I don't think it's a good idea for us to buy Nutella anymore. And so we made that a rule in our house, because she was right. I ate Nutella very quickly. And so we made that a rule. And the issue is, what can happen is, if you have that rule, you can worship the rule and not like what the intent is, which is, for me in that case, health and being careful and things like that. But when it comes to these things, it's easy to worship the forms instead of like what it is that you're actually trying to get at.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to think about as we consider just the direction of church in the next many years and everything just in general. I think that for a lot of people, denominationalism has died, and there's some good results from that.
Yeah.
And that means a lot of the things that we thought of as first importance are not as important anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that people in our generation and younger have gotten. And in some ways, churches need to catch up a little bit and understand, like, yeah, this is in a lot of ways a very good thing, because we're not worshiping like the pots and kettles washing. We're not standing back and saying, yeah, that's the way to do it, because we often can worship the forms we use to worship God instead of God.
Well, and I think in some ways, verse 8 here is actually kind of the key to the whole thing. He says, you abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. Part of what seems to be at stake here too, or sort of part of what seems to be happening a bit, is Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees may be around something that we sometimes call the oral Torah. So one of the things that's unique about the Pharisaical approach to Scripture is they seem to have developed a series of oral traditions over time. And what these oral traditions did is in a lot of ways sort of fill in the blanks from the written text. So again, sometimes I'll point out to students, go and read the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Go and read the Torah. And yeah, there's lots of laws and lots of rules and lots of things to do, but it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover every scenario. It doesn't cover every possible version of things that could happen. So what do you do when there are blanks in the text? Well, you start talking about best practices, to use our language now. And so I think in some ways what the Pharisees are trying to do is to work through kind of developing best practices. But best practices aren't the Torah. There's Torah and there's best practices. And for the Pharisees, the two in some ways become co-equal, where you have this oral tradition that becomes equal to the written text. And what Jesus, I think, is critiquing them here on is, your traditions are good when the traditions bring you closer to God, or when the traditions bring you closer to one another, but your traditions are problematic when they get in the way of getting closer to God and one another. So if we later on will look at what Jesus says, and says the whole of the law can be found in loving God and loving neighbors, the question becomes, are these traditions being carried out in such a way that we're being brought into a deeper relationship with God and a deeper relationship with one another, or have the traditions superseded that? And so I think what Jesus is ultimately saying is these traditions have become a thing in and of themselves. You know, you've created traditions that make it so you don't even take care of your parents. That's a problem.
Yeah.
The tradition has now sort of superseded the commandment. We're not being drawn closer together because of this. And I think that's where his pushback is. Traditions are good, I would say, probably until they're not.
Yeah.
Traditions are good until they become something that breaks us apart and doesn't bring us together. And so the sort of reorienting ourselves to tradition and thinking about the purpose of these traditions, I think is something that Jesus is drawing us into as well. And I think that fits very comfortably within our own denominational structures,
Yeah.
our own experiences in church. How much of what we're doing is tradition, and how much of what we're doing is what God has actually called us to do?
Yeah, and I think that just as I think about the church that I grew up in, as far as just kind of our denomination, and this is true across denominations, but there were things that we did, and I would argue that we were known often more for what we were against than what we were for.
Sure.
As far as like if I was to invite a friend as a teen in high school, I would say, well, just so FYI, you know, there's going to be a few things that are different than everyone else. And I was apologizing before the person would even come.
Right,
and I think that traditions in and of themselves are not bad.
No.
And sometimes I think what we need to do is do a better job of explaining things to people that are passed on, that this is what is really important about this. This is why this matters, and looking at it from a positive perspective, because there's great things that my grandparents and great-grandparents believed that I still believe. I would say most of my faith is a lot of stuff that they would agree with.
Yeah.
They might not agree with how sometimes I am willing to do certain things, but most of my faith, I would say, comes from them and people like passing it down and giving that to me. So tradition is awesome and important, but I think it's limited when we forget the why behind things.
Yeah.
And this is why this is important. This is why this matters. You know, we're washing these dishes to recognize the holiness of this moment. We're not just going through this as this going through the motions and washing these dishes and having really clean dishes for my mother and father to be here and for me to not honor them. That's just, it's just Jesus is trying to get. I think that just doesn't make sense.
Right. You know, you've got clean dishes and broken relationships.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't seem to fit. And I think, you know, you and I both have had plenty of opportunities to gravitate toward different religious traditions or different Christian traditions if we wanted to. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we're still here, the fact that, you know, you and I were both, you know, born and raised in churches of Christ, and we're still actively a part of this, and we have adopted and embraced and made our own many of the traditions that we've grown up with. But just because those traditions exist doesn't mean that they can't be questioned. And sometimes even the questioning of the tradition ultimately brings us back together as a community to be even sort of more united in holding to our traditions. And at other points, we step back and go, well, if what we're really wanting to do is understand the why, and if the why is something that can be accomplished with other practices, well, then thinking about other practices is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this is what Jesus is trying to argue, is I don't think he's against oral Torah, I don't think he's against oral tradition, and I don't think he's against a lot of these practices. I think his question is, are these practices bringing you closer in relationship to God and one another, or are they pulling you farther apart from God and one another? And if they're pulling you farther apart, then the tradition ceases to be helpful, it ceases to be useful. If they're drawing you together, well, then let's keep doing the things that help us love God and love neighbors more effectively and more completely.
Yeah, and I think the example that he jumps to of mother and father is like, hey, is this helping you in your relationships or not? And don't act like that doesn't matter just because you have clean, like it often is these things that we do that we then try to feel better about ourselves or try to work on it. And when I think of this story, I can't help but think of some people that I've counseled with in churches and just been with who, like, their heart is literally breaking on the inside. And they're the kind of people who were at everything. Like, they were coming, they were showing up, they were on the front row, they were excited. And I think we are so good as religious people at doing exactly what Jesus is describing here, the ritualistic washing, just I'm coming in here, I'm here for the right time, I'm going to spend some time praising God and going to leave without actually letting this touch my heart a little bit. And it's dangerous because I've just counseled people who, and it's just like, why didn't you ever say something before? Why did you come for all these years and not, like, say, this is where my heart really is? Why didn't you share that with somebody? And there's just no way that a church can program that for you. We can have you sit in accountability groups, we can have you do whatever, but unless you are willing to actually do some heart work, it's pointless. It doesn't really matter. And Jesus is trying to get everybody to say, what is actually going on inside? And Jesus speaks this, and Proverbs says, guard your heart, because everything you do flows from it. And, like, watch out. This is what actually is affecting you. It's not these outward things. You have to, at some point, examine your heart. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. I feel like we have sort of traditionally done this reading of Pharisees that critiques them for their legalism and critiques them for their holding to tradition, when many of us in the Christian tradition are just looking for our own sort of Christian to-do list. What are the things that we need to do? What are the traditions we need to hold to? What are, what things on this list do I need to check off in order to sort of be in the right place with God? And we hold the Pharisees to this critique of their legalism, when all we really want is the same sort of legalistic list, the things that we need to do. And I think Jesus makes this really interesting point. He says, look, food comes into your body, it goes into your stomach, and it passes out, and it goes in the sewer, and it's gone. So how can it really defile you? It doesn't spend that much time inside of you. It's in, it's processed, it's out. It's the stuff that enters your heart that stays. The stuff that enters your stomach doesn't. And if what's
Thank you, Jesus, for bacon, by the way. A little precursor. Thank you.
I do love this aside. Thus he declared all foods clean. And I'm like, all right. Interesting to sort of interject into the conversation.
Jump that in there. I mean, they didn't figure that out until later, but
it took what, Peter 3 times in Acts to kind of get the idea of no food is unclean. But I mean, his point here is food can't be that important in this way in terms of talking about defilement, because it doesn't linger. It doesn't stay with you. But the stuff that enters your heart, the stuff that really permeates the insides of you, it stays. And it's this kind of stuff that breeds, fornication, theft, murder, adultery.
That's just a list. That's a hefty list. She just like whoosh and just gives it all out. Yeah.
Exactly. And he's like, this is what defiles you. These things are what make you unclean, not dirty hands and dirty dishes and, the occasional, non-kosher meal.
And I think that we do often, and Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees, but one of the reasons why he's in such conflict with the Pharisees is because he agrees with them on a lot of things.
A lot of things.
And so when we think of the Pharisees, we kind of think of these like shadowy figures who are trying, and there are some ways that they're trying to set him in traps and different examples, but they're trying to gain some clarity on, okay, what is it exactly that you believe? Because that was what they would do. They would try and figure that out. When we think Pharisee, I just want you always to translate in your head, like church elder or pastor or somebody whose faith you really respect and look up to.
Yeah.
And I think for all of us who are people who are regular church attenders, this is a passage we really need to wrestle with constantly, because it's so easy to get to a point that we have these ways that we worship God and we are worshiping them instead of actually worshiping God. I've heard some really great, wonderful Christian people sound very immature about stuff like this, as far as just, well, that's not how I work, whatever it is, that's not the correct forms, and I'm just not interested in that. And I can understand perhaps why there's going to be differences of opinion on some things in that
Yeah.
mindset and model. But the key is, where's your heart? Is your heart in the right place? Is your heart able to grow from this? Can you learn more about God? Is your heart humble? And that's what's most important, because if you leave your heart unattended, everyone's capable of some pretty dark stuff.
Yeah.
If you are just washing the outside and making it look like you're all right and not really letting that stuff settle into your heart,
Yeah.
dangerous stuff happens.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, Jesus is pointing us in the direction of saying real purity and real defilement takes place in the heart. It doesn't take place on the hands.
Yeah. That's a good ending point. You get the final word with that.
Mic drop moment.
It is defilement that takes place in the heart, and that it's always stuff that comes from the inside that leads to terrible actions. It's not just outside things. So thank you guys for joining us. It's encouraging to hear your comments and to connect with you. So please let us know if you have any questions or you need anything. You can email me at brian@glendale.church. I'd encourage you to join a Zoom call that is going to be run by Lars Coburn, our associate pastor, starting in just a couple minutes. You can find the link for that at glendale.church/connect. I hope you have a great week and that you can truly answer the question this week, what is the status of your heart? Because you can only go so long with some dark stuff being in there before it leaks out. And it's important for us at times to be honest about what that is and to recognize that is truly the most important thing. Because as Jesus reminds us here, you can wash all the dishes that you want, but if you don't have good relationships with people, ultimately that doesn't matter. And those are the things that we all need to recognize and have some humility in. I hope you have a fantastic week. Thank you to Justin for sharing this time with us. And yes, we are trying to sit as far apart as possible. So
practice social distancing, wear your masks,
yes,
wash your hands, 6 feet.
We're doing what we can, just as this passage and the Pharisees encourage us to do. So hope you guys have a fantastic evening.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.